Welcome to Lexicology, the study of words. In this unit, we'll take a brief look at the evolution of Western languages. No one knows exactly when and how language began, but linguists have been able to figure out much of the history of the languages spoken today and can trace back family relationships for many years. Even languages that are no longer spoken can be traced through written documents that survive to our time. Linguists have also been able to describe many languages that we know existed, but we have no documentation for. In this unit, I'll give you some background and tell you how clever linguists have been in figuring out language history. Arguably, one of the great discoveries in historical linguistics was made by Sir William Jones in 1788. As a scholar of ancient India and a philologist fluent in several languages, Sir William Jones made a fascinating observation. He realized that Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit were similar in many fundamental ways. By looking at those three languages in detail, he was able to provide the evidence for a common root. This root is now known as Proto-Indo-European, since it included not just European languages as previously suspected, but also Sanskrit, an Indic language. His method was used and refined by later linguists to find many relationships that had never been seen before. This method is called the comparative method. The comparative method uses vocabulary items, language sounds, and the grammar from different languages to look for similarities in their structure. Words in different languages that sound similar and also have similar meanings are called cognates. An example of a cognate in English and German is the word the sun. In German, this word is die Sonne. They sound similar and refer to the same object up there in the daytime sky. There are many other cognates in German and English, as well as in other languages. You can probably think of some cognates for English and Spanish. One example is presentation and presentación. One way linguists employ the comparative method is by comparing long lists of words from different languages. They look how closely the words correspond to one another. When the words of their lexicons contain similar forms and similar meanings, they are considered cognates. Cognates indicate similar roots, but can also indicate borrowings, so it's important for historical linguists to not only know their phonology, the sounds of the languages, but also a bit of world history that might indicate borrowings from one language to another. Look through this list of words for the first 5 numbers in these 6 languages. It's apparent that one of the languages, Japanese, has little in common with the others. By comparing many words, as well as other features of languages, like the grammar and sound systems, linguists are able to make strong hypotheses about which languages are related and when their precursors split. Looking at the Venn diagram in this slide, we can think of the circles as the words of languages, with cognates in the overlapping areas. The more overlap, the closer the languages are, historically. According to this diagram, language A has little in common with language C and probably branched off from language B earlier than languages C or D. Using the comparative method, historical linguists painstakingly compared and mapped the history of many Western languages. Imagine the huge lists that had to be compiled to do this sort of work. These days, linguists can use computational power to get very nuanced views of language relationships. But in the early days of this kind of work, it was done in a slow and methodical manner. I especially like this representation of language families. The outer perimeter of this sunburst contains languages that are spoken today. Any languages that do not reach the outer perimeter are extinct languages. So, if we move from a language that exists today toward the center of the diagram, we can see that current languages have changed a lot over time. For example, if we look at the upper left-hand corner of this diagram and find Polish, we can trace this language back through West Slavic, Slavic, Balto-Slavic, and back to its origins in Proto-Indo-European. The Slavic language, a precursor to Polish, can be considered extinct. It has evolved into West, South, and East versions and is no longer spoken today. This is certainly not the only way to represent the family relations of languages, but I think it gives us a nice sense of language relationships over time. You are more likely to encounter a language tree like this one in your studies of language history. This probably looks more familiar to you and is similar to a family tree or an evolutionary tree from a biology class. You can read this as you would an evolutionary tree, with languages developing as you read down the chart. This is another representation of language relationships. It's not a chart that we would use in this introductory class, but its strength is in how it indicates the extent of overlap between languages. I include it here because I want you to get a sense of how languages evolve. Their evolution is far from being a straight line. It's a messy evolution that involves many social and political factors, with many language relationships playing a role in the final outcome. Since our class is about the English language, you're probably curious about where English came from. Before I started studying linguistics, I assumed that English came from the early tribes that were found on the British Isles, maybe from the Celts or the Picts. But I was surprised to find out that English is a Germanic language and is much more closely related to modern German than it is to Welsh. We'll look at why this is so later in the course when we consider the history of English. Like I said, this was a brief introduction. You can imagine the depth of research that goes into looking at the histories of languages. A historical linguist must not only know a lot about language, but also about history and archaeology. I hope you now have at least a taste of what historical linguists do.